Tucked away in the picturesque waters of the Bay of Bengal exists a tiny island that has captured imaginations for centuries. But its beauty as a tropical paradise is not what has garnered attention. Rather, it is the often violent, uncontacted tribe that calls the island home. For most, this island is a window into the past and an opportunity to understand how ancient people lived. But for some, this island has become their final resting place. Virtually untouched by modern civilization, the Sentinelese continue to live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They fiercely protect their homeland from outsiders, and their language, culture, and customs remain almost entirely unknown. Today we will delve deep into the history of encounters with the Sentinelese, what we know about their way of life, and discuss the ethical and philosophical problems presented to us. Without further ado, let us shed light on the mysteries that shroud this hidden jewel of the Andaman archipelago. North Sentinel Island has an area of about 60 square kilometers or 23 square miles and is relatively square in shape. It lies around 40 kilometers or 22 miles from the Andaman Islands. These islands are home to various indigenous Negrito peoples such as the Andamanese, the Anj, and the Jarawa. If you watched my last video, you would know that these people are the direct descendants of some of the first modern humans to enter Southeast Asia. Their ancestors have likely been on these islands for over 40,000 years. Though unproven, this is likely also the case for North Sentinel Island. These people have been here far longer than anything resembling civilization was developed. But in this time, the world around them has of course gone through many changes. The nearby Andaman Islands have been devastated by colonization efforts, while North Sentinel was more or less left to themselves. Though considered largely uncontacted, the island does have a detailed history of contact throughout the past centuries. First of all, the Sentinelese have probably interacted with neighboring tribes in the past hundreds or maybe thousands of years. We do know that the neighboring tribes consider them hostile in the modern day, though in the past this may have been different. It is likely that undocumented encounters, perhaps between slavers, pirates, or shipwrecks, have occurred on North Sentinel Island deep into history. The Andaman Islands have been known of for centuries, if not millennia, by mainland cultures, though they were not documented until the 9th century and did not appear on maps until 1574. John Ritchie of the East India Company was the first person to formally describe the island in 1771. Though all he said was that he saw the lights of fire on the island. A whole 96 years would pass before any mention of the island would be made. In 1867, an Indian ship named the Nineveh was wrecked by a monsoon on a reef off North Sentinel Island. All of the 86 crew survived the devastating event and made it to the beach safely. For 2 entire days, the crew survived on the beach unaware of the hostile islanders. Then on the morning of the 3rd day, they attacked. The captain of the Nineveh was quoted saying they attacked with arrows appeared to be tipped with iron. Fortunately, all of the crew was able to retreat to the ship unharmed. They were able to fend off the Sentinelese from their wooden walls with just sticks and stones. Soon after, the Royal Navy arrived and rescued the castaways. It is interesting to mention that even in 1771, the Sentinelese all seem to have had arrows tipped with iron. This may suggest other unknown shipwrecks or perhaps contact with the outside world. Due to the expansion of British India, the Andaman Islands, including North Sentinel Island, was declared part of Britain's colonial holdings. However, this did not affect the island for nearly another century. The Andaman Islands, on the other hand, were not as lucky. The British brought devastating disease and colonization in the mid to late 1800s. Around 50% of the Andamanese would die due to disease and conflict over the following years. Prison labor groups were forced to cut down the jungle and were occasionally attacked by the natives who despised them for obvious reasons. The tension heightened until coming to a fever pitch at the Battle of Aberdeen. Around 1,500 islanders attacked the prison labor colony at Aberdeen. The British already had word that the attack was coming, and the colony was protected by men with firearms and a British schooner which sat offshore. The devastating firearm and cannon fire quickly sent the islanders running with their bows and spears. Afterward, the Andamanese were compliant and subject to British colonization. They were taught some English and were also used as laborers. Poor homes were built, and many Andamanese slowly perished due to disease and poor nutrition. After a few engagements with other groups from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, they were essentially fully controlled by the British, that is except for North Sentinel. In the late 1800s, the British officer, M.V. Portman, was put in charge of the Andaman Islands. Portman was a strange figure with a peculiar interest in Andamanese men. He took many photos of these men in various mock Greek homoerotic compositions. He also had a keen interest in measuring the penises of the Andamanese. Perhaps his strange obsessions compelled him to attempt a visit to the still unspoiled North Sentinel Island. Prior to his visit, he mentioned an instance where one of his men saw people on the shore of North Sentinel. He did not land, but saw 10 men on the beach who were naked, with long hair, and were shooting fish with bows and arrows, he wrote. Other Andamanese islanders said the Sentinelese were not friendly to them because of an inter-island conflict many years ago. This account also tells us that the Sentinelese very likely had a conflict with at least some Andamanese in the recent past. This encounter and Mr. Portman's observations that the Sentinelese were different from nearby island cultures inspired his curiosity. There is a tribe on North Sentinel Island about which very little is known, though it is suspected to be quite a recent offshoot from the Little Andaman people, if indeed all communication between the two islands has actually ceased. In January of 1880, he finally decided to pay the island a visit with a large team of British, Indian, and Burmese convicts, as well as some Andamanese trackers. On his first trip, all he was able to find were abandoned villages, which he then took photos of his trackers as if they lived there. A second trip just a few days later would be disastrous. On his approach, he saw Sentinelese which quickly retreated into the forest when they saw them coming. Portman and his men continued their trek across the island until they came across the family in a thick forest. A surprised man quickly drew out his bow and a fight broke out. We don't know exactly how this fight played out, but we do know what Portman wrote in his journal. We caught 3 unhurt and brought them on board. The kidnapped group of 6, for some reason this differs from his journal, was then taken to the South Andaman Island capital of Port Blair in the interest of science. Upon reaching their first glimpse of civilization, they soon fell ill and the 2 adults died. The 4 children were taken back to their island with a number of gifts. It can be assumed that their highly infectious diseases spread to the others on the island and possibly killed many. After all was said and done, Portman wrote, "This expedition was not a success. We cannot be said to have done anything more than increase the general terror of and hostility to all comers." Later in 1883, Portman visited the island after the eruption of Krakatoa, which he mistook for gunfire on the island. He did not see anyone and placed gifts on the shore before leaving. Later, Portman said that he deeply regretted making contact with the Andamanese because of the harm that it brought to them. This would be the last visit to the island for over a decade. Then in 1896, 3 Indian convicts escaped the penal colony in Port Blair and made their way in a makeshift raft to any nearby island. A search party later found that 2 drowned in the reef while 1 made it to the beach. He was filled with arrows. This was the last time they were to be bothered for nearly half a century. As some of you may know, I have been learning Italian for a few years, and I can honestly say it is one of the most fulfilling things I have ever done. Being able to communicate with someone in an entirely different tongue allows you to understand innumerable things about their culture and way of life. But it is no easy task. I have used various services in the past, but none were as straightforward and as useful as Babbel. Instead of useless phrases, their lessons are full of real-world examples and in-depth explanations. You can start at any level of experience and have access to extremely informative lessons made directly by language teachers. Whether preparing some basic phrases for vacation or working to be a polyglot, Babbel has all the resources you need for success. I have used it every day shortly after waking up with a cup of coffee to start my day. You would be surprised how much you can learn in only a few months by creating a habit like this. I can't stress enough how eye-opening it can be to learn a new language, and I honestly hope you all pick up a new language or brush up on some old skills. Click the link in the description to get 60% off your subscription and let me know what language you are going to learn. Spero che tu impari l'italiano. In 1956, the newly formed Indian government officially declared North Sentinel Island as a tribal reserve and prevented anyone from coming within 3 nautical miles. Starting in the 1970s, the Indian government decided to make occasional gift-giving trips to North Sentinel Island in order to befriend the tribe. With the help of anthropologist Srilokanth Pandit, a team ventured onto the island in search of the Sentinelese, the first to do so in nearly a century. They discovered 18 abandoned huts alongside freshly made fires. They left them coconuts along with metal objects such as pots, hammers, and knives before returning back to their boats. On a subsequent trip, a stone tablet was left on a beach which formally declared it as part of India. A 1974 expedition by filmmakers looking to make friendly contact with a variety of native tribes saw a trip to North Sentinel Island. They brought various modern objects, including cookware and coconuts, to the beach and then waited from their boats for the Sentinelese. The islanders eventually appeared hours later, brandishing their weapons and making threatening gestures towards the outsiders. One Sentinelese shot an arrow quite a distance and injured the leg of one of the film crew. The man continued to taunt and laughed at his unfortunate victim. The crew continued to watch how the Sentinelese reacted to their gifts. The pig was speared and buried along with some of the other strange gifts such as a doll and a toy car. They were, however, fond of the aluminum pans and coconuts left for them. They eventually retreated into the forest and the expedition sailed back to harbor. Another trip in the late 70s was accompanied by 2 Andamanese Anj men. The Anj are a nearby tribe of Negrito people that were thought to be closely related to the Sentinelese. The Anj tried communicating with the Sentinelese, though no communication could be established. The Anj were frightened by the gestures and shouts despite not understanding their exact meaning. It is thought that their languages are not mutually intelligible, and this is to be expected considering their isolation. Subsequent visits continued and typically consisted of gifts being left on shore and onlookers watching the semi-hostile islanders taunt them. Sometimes the Sentinelese appeared to make quite friendly gestures, and other times they would quickly take the gifts before firing arrows at the boats. This period of fairly amicable interaction would be interrupted only a decade after it had begun. During the night of August 2nd, 1981, a ship named the Primrose lost control due to severe weather. After hours of violent waves tossing the ship, it became lodged in a coral reef off of North Sentinel Island. The 31 crew had survived the perilous hours and tough waves, but unbeknownst to them, their terror had just begun. The next morning, the captain was relieved to see that the Primrose was in no danger of sinking and that there was no need to even go ashore. That morning, a young crew member noticed small naked men peering at the vessel from shore. Soon after, there were around 50 men with bows in hand taunting the crew. The true terror began when the islanders started preparing makeshift boats to come to the vessel. Luckily, rough waves and the poor quality of their boats prevented the Sentinelese from getting close, but the weather seemed to be clearing. The panicked crew gathered whatever weapons they had for defense, including a flare gun, a few axes, and pipes. Having survived another day, a Hong Kong shipping company finally received a cable from the ship's captain urgently begging for an airdrop of weapons to fight off their attackers. The fact that they first asked for firearms instead of a rescue is telling of the true nightmare that this must have been. After several delays of failed attempts at rescue, 2 helicopter pilots from a private aviation company set off for an attempted rescue. Pushing through the treacherous weather, they were just barely able to land on top of the Primrose. The crew of 31 was able to be rescued after a total of 3 separate trips in the same day. The ship was now abandoned, and all of its cargo was left at the island, awaiting discovery by Mesolithic eyes. One could only imagine how astonishing it would have been for the Sentinelese to come aboard this vessel for the first time. A massive craft full of strange objects. Metal, so precious to the Sentinelese, everywhere. Doors on perfect hinges, clear glass windows, a control room full of buttons, a kitchen full of strange substances. If they had the courage, a dark venture into the belly of the ship. The experience that these people had can only be comparable for a person of the modern world to enter an alien spacecraft. The majority of the things that they would have seen had no comparison to anything known to them. They undoubtedly utilized many of the objects they found on board. The Primrose had about 100 tons of mainly chicken feed. Regardless, we can assume that they also went through some of the crew's quarters and other parts of the ship. It must have been a memorable experience for all involved and likely still talked about today considering the remains still lay where they sat. The wreck of the Primrose was an unexpected event in the island's history, though it did not end badly for either side. Therefore, the Indian government found it appropriate to continue to make gift-giving missions. And on a mission in 1991, there appeared to be a breakthrough. When the officials arrived at North Sentinel, the tribe gestured for them to bring gifts and then, for the first time, approached without their weapons. They even waded into the sea toward the boat to collect more coconuts. After throwing coconuts for some time, people from the crew felt safe enough to get out of their boats and directly hand them to these people. Around a month later, another expedition accomplished the same feat, with the islanders once again being friendly. Close-up footage was able to be taken of Sentinelese men and women who appear to have graciously accepted their offerings. Hilariously, one of the crew members accidentally hit a Sentinelese woman in the back with a coconut, which knocked her to the ground. However, it seemed clear to both parties that this was merely an accident. Later in this engagement, the Sentinelese began to act differently, and one man even appeared to have made a threatening gesture with his knife. The expedition decided it would be a good idea to head off, and they did so without incident. After these two peaceful encounters, it was finally deemed safe enough for salvage teams to come scrap the remains of the 16,000-ton tanker. For 2 months, laborers worked at the site of the wreckage about 400 feet away from the coast of the island. Groups of 7 to 10 men worked in shifts of a week, often in close proximity to the curious Sentinelese. Within only a few days, the Sentinelese took their makeshift boats out to investigate what was occurring. The salvage team was not frightened and offered the curious onlookers bananas. Salvage work continued for around a year and a half. The Sentinelese would make occasional visits, even climbing on board and coming within touching distance of the salvage team. Reportedly, they were quite frightened by their blowtorches. The islanders were offered scraps of metal for which they were only really interested in flat pieces rather than rods or tubes. The Sentinelese also appeared very curious of what the team was doing and never appeared hostile. They must have felt quite rich with the new influx of quality metal and other cargo from the ship. Other small fishing boats from Port Blair used to also go to the wreckage to get cargo and scrap, which means that the Sentinelese would have regularly seen modern people and their technology. After most of the valuable parts of the ship were scrapped, the team left. Today, you can still see the gutted remains of the Primrose on Google Earth. After this period, the island was left alone for quite some time. It may have been surprising to the Sentinelese that these quite frequent visits had ended. The influx of food and materials from these missions may have also led to the Sentinelese becoming semi-dependent on their visitors. The end of these visits may have upset the Sentinelese. Occasional gift-dropping missions from the Indian government continued for some years, though encounters were not always particularly friendly. At times, the Sentinelese aimed their arrows at the contact team, and once they attacked a wooden boat with their adzes. No one knows why their hostility varied throughout these missions, though it could have been related to the Sentinelese becoming sick due to contact with the outside world. In 1996, the regular gift-dropping missions officially stopped. Many officials were beginning to question the wisdom of attempting to contact a people who were healthy and content and who had been thriving on their own for thousands of years. They certainly did not need the outside world, and neither did the outside world need them. Considering that the Andamanese had been devastated by the modern world, it was realized that the same may occur with the Sentinelese if sustained contact occurred. In the following years, only occasional visits were made from a distance, again with a mixed response. After a tsunami in 2004, the Indian government decided to make 2 visits to check up on the island. They attracted international attention when a member of the tribe was photographed on a beach firing arrows at the helicopter which was checking on their welfare. You have to imagine how strange a helicopter would be to see for these people, a machine which could only be comparable to creatures of the sky. More importantly than these headlines, the tribe seemed to be healthy and were not suffering in any way. Periodic checks from boats anchored at a safe distance from shore are made to ensure that the Sentinelese appear well and have not chosen to seek contact themselves. To ensure the tribe's well-being, the Indian government follows a strict eyes-on, hands-off policy. This policy would be quickly interrupted by 2 drunk fishermen only 2 years later in 2006. The 2 fishermen were illegally fishing for mud crabs off of the island. After a day of fishing, they tossed in an anchor consisting of a rope tied to a rock, and then drank themselves to sleep. Their boat drifted towards the island under the eyes of representatives from the Society of Andaman and Nicobar Ecology. They tried yelling at the man, but perhaps because of their intoxication, they did not notice. The boat drifted into the shallows where the Sentinelese then attacked and killed the 2 men. This event marked the first known casualties in 110 years on the island. A mission looked to recover the bodies, though the Sentinelese appeared to have already buried the outsiders. Fascinating photos were taken of the islanders hanging out on the recently captured boat. The island remained uncontacted until 2018 when a strange event unfolded. A man by the name of John Allen Chau was born in 1991 in Alabama. In a Q&A later in life, he said that as a child he read such books as Robinson Crusoe and The Sign of the Beaver, a book about a white boy who befriends a Native American boy on the frontier of the 18th century Maine. I actually happened to love this book as a kid as well, but John would take this inspiration to a whole nother level. He attended a Christian high school and would go on to become a missionary and an avid outdoorsman. He traveled often, making various mission trips around the United States, Mexico, Iraq, Kurdistan, and South Africa. Somewhere during this period, he became obsessed with the idea of preaching the word to isolated native tribes. He was even found to have quoted a man named Jim Elliot, a missionary killed by a native tribe in Ecuador. Evidence suggests that early on he formed an obsession with North Sentinel Island in particular. Apparently, he specifically trained for the opportunity by learning wilderness survival techniques as well as taking linguistic and cultural anthropology courses. In October of 2018, John traveled to Port Blair, the only large port on the Andaman Islands. At this time, he wrote in his journal that he was planning to go to North Sentinel Island, a place which he called Satan's last stronghold. Man, those anthropology classes really didn't teach him a thing about anthropology, did they? Eventually, in November of that same year, he found some fishermen that were willing to take him to the island. Then, on November 14th, John arrived on the island at around 8 in the morning. He kayaked up to the shore where he encountered 2 Sentinelese. Finally, after traveling thousands of miles, he had his opportunity to preach the word to these people. They came out shouting and making gestures with their bows and arrows. John yelled at them that Jesus loved them and then threw them a large fish as a gift. The 2 islanders did not fire any arrows before John paddled away. Later, John returned to where he last saw the 2 men on his kayak. This time, 6 Sentinelese came out taunting him. John wrote in his journal that, "I tried to parrot their words back at them. They burst out laughing most of the time, so they probably were saying bad words or insulting me. I yelled some phrases and sang them some worship songs and hymns, and they would often fall silent after this." Here's when this nice meet and greet went south. A child and a young woman, both with bows and arrows, came behind, and I kept waving my hands to say no bows, but they didn't get the memo, I guess. Then a little kid with a bow and arrow came down the middle, and I figured this was it. So I preached a bit to them, starting in Genesis, and disembarked my kayak to show them that I too have legs. But the little kid shot me with an arrow, directly into my Bible, which I was holding in front of my chest. I stumbled back, and I recall yelling at the kid for shooting me. I had to swim almost a mile back to the boat at the mouth of the cove. The plan now is to rest up and sleep on the boat. Unfortunately for John, he just couldn't get enough. He wrote in his journal after this encounter, "Lord, let your will be done. If you will want me to get actually shot or even killed with an arrow, then so be it. I think I could be more useful alive though. But to you, God, I give all glory to whatever happens. I don't want to die. Would it be wiser to leave and let someone else continue? No, I don't think so. I still could make it back to the US somehow, as it almost seems like certain death to stay here. Yet there is evidence of change in just 2 encounters in a single day. We'll try again tomorrow." The following day, he wrote his last entry. "Woke up after a fairly restful sleep, heading to the island now. I hope this isn't my last note, but if it is, to God be the glory." He then wrote a goodbye passage to his family, which he said, "Please do not be angry at them or God if I get killed, and don't retrieve my body." The events of this 3rd visit are not known, but whatever happened or was said ended with John being killed by the cold iron tips of Sentinelese arrows. The fishermen who ferried Chau to North Sentinel Island said that they saw the tribesmen drag a body along the beach and bury it. The fishermen later accompanied police back to the point on the island where they believed the body was buried. 6 fishermen and 1 other person have been arrested over the incident. Clearly, John made a huge lapse in judgment, trying to spread the word to a Stone Age people who are very vulnerable to Western diseases. John's own father came out bashing evangelicals for extreme Christianity for pushing his child to a not unexpected end. This story is unfortunate for all involved, but I still can't help but see the Sentinelese as the true victims. Fortunately, the islanders have been left by themselves since 2018, and we can only hope this remains for eternity. Now that we have a picture of what contact these people have received throughout the past few hundred years, we should talk about the people themselves. There are only a handful of groups like them left on our Earth, and fortunately, we know a good deal about them, unlike some from the Amazon. First of all, we should talk about their precious island. The island has an area of only about 60 square kilometers or 23 square miles. That is about half the size of Disneyland, though Disneyland is huge, so they do actually have a decent amount of land. The island is surrounded by coral reefs, which became exposed after a 2004 earthquake that actually lifted the island around 2 meters or 7 feet. The island is completely forested, and little is known about its features. It can be seen from above that it does have various hills and high spots. Towards its center, 2 peaks rise about 122 meters or 400 feet above sea level. This is quite fortunate for the Sentinelese to survive the occasional tsunami. The trees which dot the island are mostly tropical and subtropical broadleaf trees. No coconut palm trees exist on the island, but as we know from visits, the islanders are fond to consume them. Indian boar may live on the island. Portman noted that he saw a pile of boar skulls next to a Sentinelese village. It is possible that these skulls came from elsewhere, though it is also just as likely that they are native to the island. Either way, it is weird to think that these boar may have coexisted with the Sentinelese for so long without dying out. The island is home to other food sources such as coconut crabs and many birds. Much of their diet likely comes from the surrounding waters where shellfish, fish, turtles, and possibly dolphin and shark are hunted. Though they appear to have plenty of food, telling by their healthy physiques, their population is still undoubtedly limited by the island's size. It is estimated that between 50 to 400 people have lived on the island at any given time. It is likely that infectious diseases have already made their way to the island, especially because Portman brought 4 sick children back to the island all those years ago. This may have devastated their population at the time, but I guess we could hope it made their population more immune in subsequent generations. though they are likely still quite susceptible to modern diseases. And this is why the actions of John Allen Chau are pretty bad, preaching the word to possibly make these people go extinct. Either way, from a distance they appear healthy and enjoy excellent health. They are of a smaller build and have similar features to the neighboring Andamanese. These populations are considered to be Negrito, small dark-skinned peoples with superficially African features. Interestingly, this is only skin deep. They are an East Asian population and are much more closely related to the Chinese than they are to anyone from Africa. My last video covered this fascinating topic in much more detail. Anyways, female Sentinelese wear fiber strings around their waists, necks, and heads. The men wear a thick waist belt to hold their tools and also necklaces and a headband. They carry a variety of tools which I personally find very interesting. Obviously, metal is a very hard material to work, especially without a forge or other metalworking tools. The Sentinelese almost certainly do not create complex forges and likely do not have metalworking tools such as files or hacksaws. In order to understand how they may work metal, we can look to other Stone Age cultures that have received metal throughout history. Many Stone Age people have historically been introduced to metal technology throughout the world. One interesting example would be the Native Americans. Though certain groups of Native Americans certainly did work metal, copper was cold forged in the north and arsenic bronze was even made in South America, most Native American groups were Stone Age people prior to the arrival of Europeans. When iron and steel first made its way to the North American continent, the natives were quick to take to it. Various tribes were even known to attack settlers just to scrap their metal objects. Everything from kettles to wagon hoops were cut up and fashioned into deadly arrowheads. The Comanches in particular created sleek, devastating points from whatever metal they could find. They accomplished this by painstakingly scoring the metal with a hard flake of rock until it could be bent back and forth and finally detached. The blanks were then further sharpened with an abrasive stone. This is likely how the Sentinelese work their metal objects. However, they may also use the aid of a hot fire to soften the metal in order to hammer. This is how the Maasai people work their fearsome spearheads. Considering that they did not seem to be interested in metal tools and only flat scraps when aboard the Primrose, it can be inferred that they were not able to soften the metal sufficiently for forging. From one of our only close-up photos of their knives, it is hard to tell if it had been hammered, but an obvious sharp ground edge can be seen. It is also interesting to note that it is not in a sheath. This is especially concerning considering it is in close proximity to his genitals. We know that modern knives have been gifted to the Sentinelese, though we can also assume that they created their own from scrap. I find the Sentinelese metal points to be so interesting just because of their pure size. Their arrowheads are massive compared to those of most cultures throughout history. Looking closer at their arrows, we see that they too are quite long, around the height of the shooter. Another peculiar aspect of their projectiles is the barbs fashioned right before the arrowhead. The design of these arrows is obviously for fishing. They have been seen fishing with these tools in the past, and if boar do live on the island, they of course could be used for that too. They of course shoot their arrows with bows that are of a flat bow design. To create these bows, they likely use an adze. Various men have been seen with these tools, and one man hilariously struck a boat with one. Large thrusting and throwing spears have also been documented, though images are hard to find. The Sentinelese are known to use narrow outrigger canoes to fish and hunt in shallow waters. They are steered with long poles and not paddles, so they are only limited to the shallows. With these vessels, they are known to spear and shoot fish and also turtle. If you recall, they captured a fisherman's entire vessel along with the Fisherman in 2006. Though these men were quickly killed and buried, it can be assumed that many of their items were utilized. Though it is not known what they had on board, they certainly had a good amount of fishing equipment as well as many other modern-day objects. Perhaps they began to utilize good steel hooks and strong line. Knowing how polluted the world is, they have almost certainly come across line and hooks before, though it is not known if they have utilized it. We know that one of the main ways they sustain themselves is by feeding on various shellfish such as mollusks. Now that we have a basic understanding of their technology and what they are capable of, we must ask, are they living in the Stone Age? Clearly they have plenty of metal objects which they regularly utilize, though we know that they cannot produce these objects. Some Inuit societies worked iron from meteorites, though they were still arguably Stone Age societies. And to work metal objects, they are likely using stone to score and shape the metal. Some have considered them Neolithic people, but the Neolithic is characterized by the domestication of animals and the practice of agriculture. The reality is that these people do not fit into our classifications of Paleolithic, Mesolithic, or Neolithic. They should just be considered an uncontacted tribal people. The existence of this island in the Sentinelese in the 21st century raises various ethical and moral questions. The modern world has already meddled with North Sentinel Island for hundreds of years. They know how we present ourselves and the mysterious technology that accompanies us. They have heard us speak our various tongues and operate machines that must appear as magic. They have reacted in various ways to our attempts at contact, and recently they have reacted with violence. Do they know of our ability to wipe them out with ease? Do they think of possible consequences of their aggression? Do they think that they might be preventing us from aggressing towards them? These are all questions we can only hope to answer with how we might react in similar situations. But we are not them. Their culture is alien to anything we could possibly think of. Neighboring populations may be able to understand them better, but their culture is at least very linguistically different and possibly even alien to their neighbors. The Sentinelese could hypothetically be a mirror of our own reaction to the existence of a technologically superior extraterrestrial civilization. The zoo hypothesis posits that an assumed advanced civilization of extraterrestrials is aware of us, though refrains from direct contact. In this situation, we are essentially in a zoo being watched from curious onlookers just as the Sentinelese are. Aliens might be refraining to contact us until we reach a certain level of technological innovations or even political or ethical standards. It is possible that they are waiting until we have the ability to directly contact them. The Sentinelese still live in a very primitive way, for a lack of a better term. If they were to advance technologically or perhaps morally, we may feel the need to reach out and to aid in their coming to civilization. Though another scenario would consist of them making direct contact to us. If they were able to construct a seaworthy vessel capable of reaching the nearby Port Blair, they could directly reach out. They are likely capable of doing so, though choose not to for various reasons. From looking at the natural reaction of the Sentinelese to our presence, we may be able to learn some things about how we would react to an extraterrestrial presence. Considering there is certainly credible evidence to suggest that we actually do live in the zoo hypothesis, this is something that we should seriously consider. As for the Sentinelese, I think we can all agree that they are better left alone. Though they likely have some immunity to modern diseases at this point, they would still suffer dearly from sustained contact. This can be affirmed when looking at how other nearby populations reacted to introduction into the modern world. Both the Anj and the Jarawa tribes were brought into modern ways. Though many initially died of disease, they were given medicine and sanitary living conditions in an attempt to improve their quality of life. This proved to be a mistake in decades past. Many of the people suffer from poor health due to unhealthy diets, sedentary lives, and addictions to alcohol and cigarettes. Some travel companies which frequented the Jarawa were even accused of organizing human safari tours so that tourists could catch a glimpse of these supposedly Stone Age people. These people are certainly living in far worse conditions than they enjoyed centuries ago. With this in mind, the Sentinelese are actually very lucky to have been able to avoid the modern world for so long. From what can be seen from a distance, the Sentinelese are extremely healthy and thriving. They appear proud, strong, and full of life with, at any given time, many children and pregnant women. They will remain in a strange standstill of technology and culture as the modern world continues to progress around them. They essentially live in a different reality from us. One can only imagine how they interpret the outsiders. I myself am very happy we still have people like this around enjoying the life that their ancestors have enjoyed for time immemorial. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a comment, a like, or whatever could help. Also, check out the social media such as Instagram, Twitter, or I guess X, or whatever you want to call it. This has been your host, North02, and I hope to see you on the next one. Arrivederci.
Iya, vamos con que está, Yeah!